While testing the 16mm 1.4 and the 16mm 2.8, there were quite a few things that stood out to me. First of which is that I enjoyed the 16 2.8 way more than I was anticipating. It paired superbly with the XT1 and it was an absolute blast to use. The autofocus was really snappy and responsive, and the image quality for what I was using it for was great. As for the 1.4 version, I noticed that for whatever reason, just between the two, I didn't really like shooting with it as much. It was much bigger and heavier, and I found the autofocus to be a little bit more sluggish and hunty than the 2.8, and it wasn't a huge deal. I mean, it's not a a deal breaker by any means, but I felt like it when comparing between the two, it kind of ruined the experience a little bit. The other thing I've noticed between the two is that the 1.4 is technically superior to the 2.8 as far as image quality goes. It retains much better contrast and color, especially in bright situations or backlit situations, and we're going to look into that a little bit in Lightroom. Also, the minimum focusing distance of either lens is different, and the 1.4 can get really close in on subjects, which can be pretty fun in certain scenarios. But two lenses that are the exact same focal length, well, almost the exact same focal length, we'll talk about that, but they're very, very different. Very different price points, different apertures, different sizes, just everything about the two lenses are really, they're really two extremely different lenses in a lot of cases. And which one you want or need really depends. So with all that being said, let's get into Lightroom and look at a couple of comparison photos. Okay, so first for the close focusing test, the minimum focusing distance of the two lenses, you'll see the 1.4 is on the left here and the 2.8 is on the right. And you can see there's a pretty good difference. Now the 2.8 isn't terrible by any means, especially given the focal length. That's not bad. But when compared to the 1.4, it definitely has the advantage there. You can definitely get a lot of detail, your subject really big in the frame. So, that's one really fun thing about the 1.4 is being able to get really close in on subjects. And as we go 2 to 1 here, you can see there's just, f8 on both lenses. A little bit of smudging on the watch there, but a lot of good detail, and it's really handy sometimes to be able to focus that close. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the actual field of view of either lens. Now with this scene here, I was locked off on a tripod. I did bracketed exposures of each camera because the sky was just super blown out. So I bracketed exposures, then removed the lens, and then put the other lens on so nothing moved. The camera was in the exact same position. So in theory, you should have the exact same field of view for both lenses. Now here's the 1.4, and we're just going to toggle back. Here's the 2.8. 1.4 again, 2.8. Now immediately you'll notice that the 2.8 is wider, considerably so. To me, that's actually a significant difference between the two as far as the field of view goes. And I didn't realize this going in. I thought they were both, this exact same field of view because they're 16 millimeters, but they vary. So keep that in mind. I don't know if the 16 2.8 is actually wider than 16, or if it's correct and the 16 1.4 is actually longer than 16. But what I've read is some people think that the 16 is actually about 15, whereas the 16 is right at 16. So, that may be a downside to you. It may not be that big of a deal, but side by side, it's definitely noticeable. Now, the other thing we'll notice when looking at these two side by side is that the 1.4 on the left here retains a lot more contrast and color. So what I mean by that is let's zoom into the corner here especially and look at the tree on either image. Exact same lighting scenario and everything, and the colors and the contrast and the detail in the 1.4 looks way better than the 2.8. It is kind of washed out, faded, and really it is like that over the entire image. If we go to the middle, you can see it right here and then right in here. And it's the same in the corners. It just loses a lot of contrast and color. And even down here into the green, the deep greens and the deep shadows. The 1.4 kind of eats the 2.8's lunch here in this scenario. And even when we go to the raw files of the shadow exposure that I did, to really bring out the shadows, you'll see that it's just the 1.4 with that blown out sky just did such a good job at retaining the contrast within the trees. Whereas the 2.8 really is, there's a significant difference there. And once again, it's like that across the whole frame. Okay, so let's see that scenario play out yet again in a situation that I find myself in all the time with my real estate photography. Now, this focal length is a focal length I shoot at for about 80 to 90% of all my real estate shots. So I wanted to see how it would perform in a real estate scenario. So what I do is I shoot one image exposing for the shadows in the room, just a really natural light, good ambient exposure. But my highlights, like the window, is going to be extremely blown out, which is no big deal because I shoot a flash exposure and then blend the flash exposure into the ambient shot in Photoshop. Essentially what I end up with is a shot that is mostly the ambient shot with just some of the highlights from the flash in the window kind of blended in. Anyway, I digress. The point is, I take an ambient exposure, just like this. The 1.4 is on the left and the 2.8 is on the right. And you'll notice, given the exact same exposure between the two, the 2.8 yet again has so much trouble retaining contrast and color with those bright lights coming in. You can see it all around the window. You can see it in the bed, especially if we zoom in here. The 1.4 just does such a phenomenal job in this scenario. And it really washes out the paint on the walls around it. And then just the pillow and the bedspread, everything is just more contrasty. All the detail is retained. Technically it's just superior for the 1.4. I would have a hard time using the 2.8 in a real estate scenario like this because even after taking a flash shot and blending the two, I end up using most of the natural light exposure and just all that haze and, lack of contrast is really hard to correct. So for this scenario, I had a tripod, locked the camera off on a tripod, had her stand in the exact same position, and I made sure she stood perfectly still without moving forwards or backwards. So she was basically a statue, and she did a really good job. So I took one shot with the 1.4 and then swapped out the lens, put the 2.8 on. So in theory, nothing changed as far as the distance to the subject. Everything was locked off. And, I'm sure there was a slight margin of error of her maybe moving forward just a tad, but you'll notice the difference in the field of view. The 1.4 is much closer to her than the 2.8. Not only is the field of view different, and you can tell kind of by the sleeve of her arm how much room is left between her arm and the sleeve, and she's just overall bigger in the frame, but both were shot wide open, and you can obviously tell the background blur difference and the shallow depth of field you can get. But the 1.4 looks warmer. The colors look a little nicer. The image looks softer overall, which to me, between the two, if I was doing a portrait like this, I really prefer the 1.4. It looks great. And if we zoom in 1:1, just to kind of check out the sharpness and detail, the 2.8 is pretty sharp, and so is the 1.4. But I have to say, in this particular scenario, the 1.4 is looking great, and I actually prefer the look overall, the colors, the field of view. And I could have gotten in closer on the 2.8, but once again, that kind of defeats the purpose. I'm getting in closer, maybe distorting her head a little more. I think the 1.4 really shines in this particular case. All right, so for this shot, we have the 1.4 on the left again at 2.8 just to kind of show you what it looks like stopped down to the 16 2.8. And once again, there's a little bit better color on her skin, I think, than the 2.8. The 1.4 is a little more magenta, a little more yellow in her skin, where the 2.8 is a little colder. Zooming in 1:1, we can take a closer look, and both lenses are sharp. But once again, I like the color on her face better than the 2.8, and in her skin, I think it looks nicer. And you'll notice that even though both lenses are stopped down to 2.8, the 1.4 has a little better separation of the subject, a little better shallow depth of field, a little more actually than this one, because the 16 2.8 is a wider field of view, so you're getting even less shallow depth of field at any given aperture, and given the same distance. So even the 1.4 at 2.8 looks softer and has a better look for this type of a shot than the 2.8 does, or at least in my opinion. So now we'll take a look at some somewhat side-by-side autofocusing comparisons. So I had a little scenario set up to where I was trying to show you, so you could get an idea of how the two lenses perform. Unfortunately, I tried to mic it so you could hear the noise, and really the noise in the two lenses are not noticeable at all. And so the gain on the mic was way high, and you could just hear more of the ambient noise in the refrigerator running than you could the actual autofocus motor. So it doesn't have sound, but you can see the speed and the snappiness and the responsiveness in this particular scenario of the two lenses. Now, I will say I found that the 16 1.4 in real world usage was a little bit more sluggish and not as snappy as the 2.8. And I found it to be a little more sluggish than even shows in my little scenario test I have. Especially when shooting with the 2.8 and then taking the 1.4 out, I noticed a difference, and a surprising difference. I actually felt like even more unresponsive or sluggish than an older lens like the 35 1.4. So while it wasn't, a deal breaker or horrible, I did notice a difference, and it wasn't as fun to shoot with, as far as that went. But I really found that the 2.8 focused pretty quick with the XT1 or the XT2. Really no complaints on my end. It was kind of like the 35 f2 if you've shot with that. It's that sort of snappy. It's that sort of quick. The 16 1.4 I honestly would equate to the 56 1.2 as far as how it feels to focus and the quickness of it. In my mind, it's really close to that. But anyway, given the side-by-side comparisons, what do you guys think? When I used the 2.8, I really didn't notice for my use case and my philosophy of use, the differences in image quality were not apparent to me when using the 2.8, especially on vacation. I was just really thrilled with all the photos I got, and for what I would use this focal length for in personal work, the 2.8 is just great for me. Despite it lacking contrast in backlit scenarios, the price, the size, the fun factor, the autofocus, everything about it lends itself well to a lens I want to use on the XT1 for documenting my son, for personal work, and things like that. But the 16 1.4 is fantastic. The image quality is excellent. You can get great shallow depth of field. You really get a good look if you're going to do environmental portraits. It has good color rendition. It's got good contrast. Overall, technically, it is a great lens, really good image quality, and obviously superior to the 2.8. And for $1,000, I would want it to be. But for me, the price mixed with the size and weight and the more sluggish autofocus and the way it just fits on the XT1, it wasn't as fun for me to use. The 2.8 was the lens that really just, I don't know, it made shooting at that focal length really fun and enjoyable, and I couldn't wait to shoot with it. Every time I saw it sitting on the XT1, I just wanted to pick it up and go shoot. So at any rate, that is my comparison video of the two lenses. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took something away from it and enjoyed the photos. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.